My husband once told me, "I've found someone who listens better." At first, I stayed silent, but then the next day, his someone called me by mistake, and when I answered, everything I thought I knew about my marriage came crashing down. My name is Grace Whitford, and today I'm sharing a story that I never thought would belong to me. But before I begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing how far and wide our stories can travel from small towns to big cities and every cozy living room in between. Main story begins. I always thought of my marriage as steady, not perfect, but dependable, like an old oak tree, weathered but still rooted. Edward and I had been married for decades, and in that time, we built a life that looked from the outside at least solid. We had our routines, morning coffee together, crossword puzzles on Sundays, and dinners where we'd talk about the day, even if the topics grew smaller as the years went on. We weren't the couple that made a scene at parties, or the kind that celebrated every anniversary with fireworks. No, our love was the quieter sort, the kind that settles in your bones like a familiar melody. At least that's what I believed. But over time, I began to notice shifts, subtle at first, so small that if you mentioned them to anyone else, they'd laugh and say I was imagining things. Edward started staying up later, scrolling on his phone with the brightness turned low. When I'd ask what he was looking at, he'd smile in that dismissive way of his and say, "Oh, just reading the news." But the news doesn't make a man grin at his phone like a boy reading a love letter. Then there were the excuses, small ones. A stop at the store that took far too long. Work calls that ended with him sitting silently in the den, staring into space. His temper shortened too. As though every question I asked, even simple ones like, "What do you want for dinner?" became a burden he no longer wished to carry. I tried to brush it aside. After all, isn't that what we do in long marriages? We tell ourselves, it's just a phase, he's tired, he's getting older, I shouldn't read too much into it. And so, I kept folding laundry, making meals, watering the plants, carrying on with life as if everything was still normal. But the distance between us wasn't something I could ignore forever. It grew like a crack in the ceiling. Fine at first, barely visible, then widening until you can't help but notice it every time you look up. The moment that crack split wide open was on a Wednesday evening. We just finished dinner. I was clearing the plates and Edward was sipping his usual cup of tea. I asked him something ordinary. I think it was about fixing the squeaky back door. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there staring into his cup like he was trying to read tea leaves, and then without looking at me, he said it. "I found someone who listens better," just like that. Plain, matter of fact, as if he were mentioning that he preferred a different brand of jam. The words froze me in place. I remember the sound of a plate slipping from my hands, clattering onto the counter. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was a joke or that I'd misheard him. But he didn't. He just lifted the cup to his lips and took another sip, like he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of our quiet little kitchen. My first instinct was to shout, to demand names, explanations, answers. But something inside me, call it pride, call it wisdom, born of age, told me to stay still. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing you crumble. So I swallowed the lump in my throat, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and said nothing. Inside, though, my mind was racing. Who was this someone? How long had this been going on? And perhaps most painful of all, when had I stopped being enough? That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the steady rise and fall of Edward's breathing beside me. He slept peacefully, as though the words he'd spoken carried no weight at all. But for me, those words echoed, bouncing around in my skull like stones thrown against glass. I stared at the ceiling, thinking back over our years together. The trips we'd taken, the home we'd built, the children we'd raised. Was all of it diminished now, overshadowed by the presence of this new listener? Or was this just the latest crack in something that had been splintering for a long time? By morning, I'd made a quiet decision. If Edward thought he could find someone who listened better, then I needed to start listening to myself. And the first thing I heard, clear as a bell, was a warning. Protect yourself, Grace. Don't wait for the storm to take everything from you. I smiled through breakfast that morning, acting as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was already making plans. After Edward's words, I found someone who listens better. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even confront him. Instead, I thought of something my mother used to say when I was a girl. "Grace, when you see clouds rolling in, don't waste time arguing with the sky. Get your umbrella." Well, I could see the storm clouds now, and I wasn't about to stand outside and let myself be soaked. The very next morning, I made a decision. One that required no shouting, no accusations, no raised voices, just quiet action. I transferred the money from our joint savings account into my own personal account, every cent of it. Now, to some that may sound cold, but you must understand, I wasn't doing it out of spite. I was doing it out of survival. I had seen enough women, friends, cousins, even neighbors, who were blindsided by betrayal and left with nothing but memories and regret. I wasn't about to add my name to that list. I remember sitting in the bank, my heart thumping in my chest, pretending to be calm as the teller went through the paperwork. She didn't ask questions. Perhaps she saw the steel in my eyes. Perhaps she'd seen women like me before. By the time I left, my hands were still shaking. But there was a strange peace in my chest. If Edward's storm was coming, I now had a roof over my head. Back home, I carried on as though nothing had changed. I made dinner, watered the plants, laughed politely when he told me some half-hearted story about his day. All the while I watched, I became attuned to him in a way I hadn't been for years. Every glance at his phone, every late-night text, every excuse became a piece of a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. And the more pieces I gathered, the clearer the picture became. Edward was not just distracted. He was elsewhere. Sometimes it's the small details that betray the truth. The faint smell of perfume on his coat. Not mine, not any I'd worn. A dinner receipt crumpled in his pocket from a restaurant he'd never invited me to. The way his voice softened when he spoke into the phone. A tone I hadn't heard directed at me in a long while. I didn't let on. Oh no, I smiled. I nodded. I played the part of the oblivious wife. But inside, I was cataloging it all. A quiet archivist of betrayal. And yet, even with all my observations, I still had no face, no name to place on this mysterious someone. Was she a stranger, a colleague, an old flame rekindled? The not knowing gnawed at me more than the betrayal itself. One evening, as I folded laundry, I asked myself aloud, what does he mean by someone who listens better? Was it really about listening? Or was it about wanting to feel young again? To have someone hang on his every word as if he were still the charming man he once had been? I couldn't answer those questions yet, but I could prepare myself for the answers when they came. So quietly, carefully, I began to shift my world into one that no longer depended on Edward's presence. I reviewed the household bills. I organized important papers. I looked at the house not just as our shared space, but as a place I might one day stand alone in. It wasn't easy. In fact, it broke my heart a little each time I folded his shirts or set his plate at the table. But I reminded myself, diggin' first, emotions later. Still, Edward had no idea. He carried on laughing into his phone, brushing off my questions with short answers. He thought he was being clever. He thought I was blind. But what he didn't realize, what men like him never seem to realize, is that women of my generation, women who've held families together through hardship, who've worked quietly in the background while others took the spotlight, we notice things. We may not shout, but we see. And I saw enough to know that something was coming. I didn't know when or how, but I felt it in my bones like a kettle just about to whistle, like a clock ticking closer to midnight. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the revelation would come not from Edward himself, but from a stranger's voice on the other end of the phone, and when it did, it would change everything. This is the turning point of it happened on an ordinary morning. One of those days where nothing seems remarkable at all. The kettle whistled, the birds chattered outside the window, and Edward had already left the house, saying he had errands to run. I was tidying the kitchen when the phone rang. At first I almost didn't answer. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and I've reached the age where most of those calls are either charities asking for donations or machines trying to sell me things I don't need. But something, call it instinct, made me pick up. "Hello, this is Grace," I said. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a woman's voice came through, soft, uncertain, almost trembling with excitement. "Oh, Edward," she said, "I just wanted to hear your voice. Are we still on for tomorrow? I can't wait to see you." My breath caught in my throat. She thought she was speaking to him. She thought I was Edward. I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air. She went on, oblivious. "I was thinking maybe we could go back to that little restaurant you liked, the one with the corner booth. You said you felt so comfortable there. I haven't stopped thinking about the way you looked at me." Her voice trailed, dreamy and tender. Finally, I spoke. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled where I gripped the phone. "This isn't Edward. This is his wife." Grace silence, a sharp intake of breath, then the unmistakable sound of panic in her voice. Oh, I must have, oh no. I thought I'm so sorry. She fumbled, stammered, and then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as if it had just turned into something poisonous. Now, you might be wondering how she even had my number. That puzzled me at first too, but as I thought it over, the answer became painfully clear. Edward had me saved in his phone as Grace, and for his own convenience, he had his other number, his work line, saved simply as Ed. Melissa, though I didn't know her name just yet, must have copied his contacts at some point. Perhaps he'd handed her his phone to call herself, or maybe she'd glanced at his list of numbers and stored them quickly. And in her rush, she'd confused Grace with Ed. A single tap of her finger, and she dialed me instead of him. A mistake so small, and yet it ripped open everything. I sat there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, my heart thudding so loudly it felt like the whole neighborhood could hear it. There it was. Proof. No more guessing, no more piecing together scraps of suspicion. The truth had walked right into my kitchen and spoken into my ear. And here's the thing that might surprise you. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I felt an odd kind of clarity. Like a fog had lifted, and the picture in front of me was finally sharp. The words Edward had spoken. I found someone who listens better. Suddenly had a face, a voice, a shape. I didn't know who she was yet, or how long she'd been in the picture. But I knew enough. Enough to steady myself. Enough to prepare for the next move. I placed the phone gently back on the receiver as though setting down something fragile. My hands were still trembling, but my mind was already racing ahead. Who was she? How had they met? And perhaps the cruelest question of all, had Edward given her the tenderness he once reserved for me? I took a deep breath, smoothed down the tablecloth, and whispered to myself, "Well, Grace, the storm has arrived. But storms, you see, can do more than destroy. They can also clear the air." And I was ready to find out exactly who this woman was and how far Edward had fallen. What I didn't know, not yet, was just how close to home this betrayal truly was. After that phone call, I couldn't look at Edward the same way again. Every smile he gave me, every casual touch on the shoulder, every ordinary word from his lips, all of it felt rehearsed, hollow. Like lines spoken by an actor who had already left the stage in his heart. But if there's one thing about me, it's this. I am patient. Always have been. Patience is a skill you develop when you've lived through decades of raising children, managing a household, and enduring a husband's moods. Patience sharpens your eyes. It lets you see what others overlook. So, I watched. At first, I started with the obvious, his receipts. Edward had a habit of tucking them into his jacket pockets, forgetting them entirely. One afternoon, while hanging his coat, I found a crumpled slip from a restaurant across town, an Italian place with a reputation for being discreet. Couples went there when they wanted shadows more than candlelight. I knew because a neighbor once whispered to me about the booths in the back. The receipt was for 2 entrees and a bottle of wine. A wine Edward never ordered with me because he claimed it gave him heartburn. I smoothed the paper between my fingers and thought, heartburn for me, romance for her. Then there was the scent, a perfume that wasn't mine, faint floral clinging to his shirt collar. I hadn't worn perfume in years. Edward used to complain it was too strong, and yet here he was carrying another woman's fragrance home like a secret tucked under his skin. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I tucked away the receipt in my nightstand, like a bookmark in the story I hadn't finished reading. The next clue came through his phone. Edward was careless, far more than he realized. He guarded his device when I was around, yes, but sometimes he left it on the counter, buzzing with messages. I never snooped. I didn't need to. All I had to do was glance. I saw the way his eyes lit up when a certain name appeared. Melissa. Melissa. A name that struck a faint bell in my memory, though I couldn't place it right away. That evening, as I washed dishes, the name turned over and over in my mind. Where had I heard it before? Then it came to me like a thread pulled from a long-forgotten sweater. Melissa was the daughter of my friend Elaine. Elaine, who had invited us to family barbecues, who had once leaned on me when her husband was ill. Melissa, the young woman who used to come around with her mother, who had called me Aunt Grace when she was little. I remembered her sitting at my kitchen table, swinging her legs, asking if she could help me frost cookies. My knees nearly buckled at the realization. It wasn't just some faceless woman from nowhere. It was someone who had been in my home. Someone who had looked me in the eye with the innocence of youth. And now she was whispering into my husband's ear, calling him when she thought she was calling him, but reaching me instead. The betrayal deepened. Not just Edward's, but hers too. I sat at the table that night, staring at the wood grain, tracing the patterns with my fingertips. How long had this been going on? Had Elaine known, or was she as blind as I had been? Edward came in, humming to himself, loosening his tie like he was the picture of a normal, weary husband. I studied him carefully. Did he feel guilt? Did he know that I knew number? His face was calm, smug almost. He thought he was clever. He thought he was safe. But I knew better. And I knew something else too. If I confronted him now in anger, I'd lose the upper hand. Anger burns fast. I needed to be cold, steady, silent. So, I smiled when he asked about dinner. I folded his shirts. I placed the receipt back in my nightstand. Inside, though, I was building my case, not for a courtroom, but for myself, so that when the time came, I would not falter. I'd always thought betrayal would feel like fire, but in truth, it felt like ice, cold, clear, cutting. And as I pieced the puzzle together, one thing became certain. The day of reckoning was coming. I'd always imagined that if betrayal ever came knocking at my door, I'd meet it with fury, shouting tears, perhaps even throwing a dish or two against the wall. That's what the movies teach us, isn't it? That anger is the natural response. But when the time came, I found I didn't want fire. I wanted ice. So I set the stage. One evening, I prepared Edward's favorite meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans with a drizzle of lemon. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, warm and inviting. I set the table with the good china, lit 2 candles, and poured him a glass of red wine. The same wine I knew he'd shared with her. When he came home, he looked surprised. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Oh, just a little something," I said with a smile. "I thought we could sit together, talk like old times." He relaxed, clearly relieved by the normally. He sat, ate, even complimented the meal. For a while we talked about ordinary things: the garden, a letter from our son, the price of groceries. I kept my voice calm, my eyes steady. I let him believe just for a moment that all was well. And then, midway through the meal, I set down my fork and looked him directly in the eye. "Melissa called me," I said. The effect was immediate. He froze, his hand halfway to his glass. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, his face drained of color. "What?" His voice cracked on the word. "She thought she was calling you," I continued evenly. "But instead, she dialed me. She told me how much she was looking forward to seeing you. She mentioned the little restaurant you like." "Do you remember that restaurant, Edward?" he stammered. "Grace, that's not... You've misunderstood. Don't insult me," I said sharply, though my voice never rose. "I know, and I've known for longer than you realize." He opened his mouth, then closed it again like a fish gasping on dry land. His hands shook as he reached for his glass, but he didn't drink. "You've been careless," I said. "Receipts in your pocket, perfume on your shirt, your face lighting up every time her name appeared on your phone. I may be older, Edward, but I am not blind." He tried to protest, then to tell me it was harmless, a friendship, a mistake. But the words tumbled out weak, unconvincing. Finally, he slumped back in his chair, defeated. "Grace," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean I wasn't thinking." "No," I cut in. "You were thinking. You just weren't thinking of me." The silence stretched between us, thick as smoke. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. He had always been the one with the upper hand, the one who decided what we talked about when we traveled, how the money was spent. But in that moment, as he sat pale and trembling, I realized I was the one holding the res. I already moved the savings. I told him calmly, "They're in my account now. Whatever happens next, I'll be fine." His eyes widened. That shook him more than my knowledge of Melissa. He understood in that instant that I wasn't just the wounded wife. I was a woman who had prepared, who had safeguarded herself against his choices. "You can beg, Edward. You can explain. You can weep if you like, but you cannot undo what you've done." He leaned forward then, desperation flickering in his eyes. "It was a mistake, Grace. She doesn't mean anything. It was foolishness." I raised an eyebrow. Foolishness that lasted long enough for her to call me by mistake. His mouth snapped shut. I stood gathering the plates calmly, as if the conversation were no more remarkable than discussing the weather. I'll decide what happens next. Not you. For once, Edward, you'll have to wait for me to listen instead of finding someone who listens better. And with that, I left him sitting in the candlelight, staring into his glass of wine like it might hold the answers he couldn't find in himself. After that night, nothing in our home felt the same. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. Edward moved about like a man walking on thin ice, afraid each step would send him plunging into the water below. He tried, of course. Oh, how he tried. The very next morning, he brought me coffee in bed, something he hadn't done in years. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk together, suggested we might visit the farmer's market on Saturday like we used to. He even offered to fix the squeaky back door I'd been mentioning for months. But I could see through it all. These weren't acts of love, they were acts of desperation. Not the gestures of a husband cherishing his wife, but of a man terrified of losing the comfort and stability she provided. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from sleepless nights. "Grace," he said softly, "I made a terrible mistake. I was foolish. I let myself get carried away with attention I shouldn't have wanted, but it didn't mean anything. You're my wife. You're the one I love. Please, can we just put this behind us?" I listened in silence, my face calm. Inside, though, a storm swirled. Forgiveness. Such a heavy word, isn't it? We're taught from childhood that forgiveness is noble, that it heals wounds. But what no one tells you is that forgiveness doesn't rebuild trust. And trust, once broken, is a fragile thing, like a porcelain vase shattered on the floor. You can glue it back together, yes, but every crack will still show. I thought of the years we'd spent together, the children we raised, the struggles we survived, the small joys we once shared. I thought of the vows we had spoken all those years ago when our hair was darker and our eyes brighter, for better or for worse. Was this the worst we had promised to endure? And yet I also thought of the way Melissa's voice had trembled with longing when she mistook me for Edward. I thought of the receipt, the perfume, the lies. I thought of how easily he had dismissed me with those cruel words. I found someone who listens better. So I asked myself, was it love he wanted to save, or was it simply the life he feared losing? I turned to the audience in my own mind, to women like you, women who know what it is to carry the weight of a marriage through decades. Would you take him back? Would you open the door to someone who had already walked out of it in his heart? I didn't answer him that night. Instead, I told him the truth. I need time, I said. Time to decide if the man you've become is one I can still share my life with. You don't get to decide that for me. He nodded, though the relief in his eyes betrayed his fear. He thought time meant hope. He thought patience meant forgiveness. But as the days passed, I began to see more clearly. Edward wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the life I had built around him. The warm meals, the tidy house, the shared finances, the image of stability. He was clinging not to love but to comfort. And that more than anything broke whatever tenderness I still felt for him. For you see, I realized then that a man who seeks someone who listens better isn't truly seeking love. He's seeking an audience. And I was no longer willing to play that part. In the weeks that followed, I moved through our house like a woman seeing it for the first time. The same rooms, the same furniture, the same familiar walls. Yet everything looked different to me because now I wasn't seeing a shared life. I was seeing a space I had carried, cleaned, warmed, and sustained on my own for years. I began to untangle our lives quietly, thread by thread. I visited the bank again, this time to make sure not just the savings, but also our accounts and estate were secure in my name. I spoke to a lawyer calmly, firmly, asking what steps I'd need to take if separation became reality. I didn't tell Edward at first. Why would I? He had told me once that Melissa listened better. Well, I was finally listening to my own voice, to my own needs. At home, Edward still tried. Flowers appeared on the table, notes tucked into my book, clumsy apologies written in a shaky hand. He hovered around me, offering to help, trying to make me laugh, waiting for me to soften. But the harder he tried, the clearer it became. His actions weren't born of love. They were born of fear. Fear of being alone, fear of losing the comfort I provided, fear of facing himself. And the more I saw it, the more I knew I wasn't afraid. One morning, as I stood in the garden watering the roses, I felt a calmness wash over me, the kind of calm you feel after a storm has finally passed. When the air smells clean and the earth feels new, I realized then that I had already made my choice. That evening, I sat Edward down. He looked at me with hopeful eyes, as if he still believed I might forgive. Forget, fold back into the shape of the wife I had always been. But I didn't smile this time. Edward, I said quietly, we've shared decades together. We raised children. We built a home. We lived through so much. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner. You went looking for someone else to hear you, to make you feel important. You betrayed my trust. And now you want to stay because it's easier than leaving. He opened his mouth, but I raised a hand. No, listen for once. You don't love me, Edward. Not in the way I deserve to be loved, and I no longer love the man you've become. His shoulders slumped. His eyes brimmed with the panic of a man realizing the life he thought was guaranteed had slipped through his fingers. I stood. My voice was steady. I've chosen myself. You'll manage without me and I'll thrive without you. And that was that. No slam doors, no shouting, just quiet, final truth. In the days that followed, I began the slow work of building a new life. Not a glamorous one, not the kind that would make headlines, but one of peace, dignity, and independence. I cooked meals for myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I filled my evenings with books, with letters to friends, with walks in the fading light. And most importantly, I listened to my own voice, to the rhythm of my own heart, to the quiet joy of freedom. When someone tells you they found someone who listens better, it feels like the cruelest cut. But what I've learned is this. Sometimes it's the universe reminding you to stop straining to hear someone else and start listening to yourself. So here I am telling you this story, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the strength I didn't know I had. Gratitude for the storm that forced me to build shelter for myself. Gratitude for the ending that became a beginning. And now I turn to you, the ones listening. Tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have forgiven? Would you have stayed? Or like me, would you have chosen a new beginning? I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And wherever you're watching from, thank you for listening, truly listening.